Okay, so now in this video we're going to go ahead and program our base pin. And so for the sake of this video and for my classes, I'm going to program this as if I'm going in our Haas lathe. And so to do that, I like to program with the tooling that I have set up in the lathe. So when you look at this document here, or this folder here, I have 10 tools in here, and these are the tools that I actually have set up in my lathe. For the sake of following along and for my current students to be able to accurately program this and run it in the machine, I want you to use this same tool library. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this zipped folder here, and that will give you these 10 tools in a folder. And then I will show you as I'm programming how to grab them out of this folder instead of using Mastercam's generic tool library. So to get started, before I can create my machine and start programming, we have to do a step in Mastercam, and that's changing our plane over to a plus D plus Z plane, and I'll show you what that is. So if I go to my planes menu, I'm going to come up here to where you see this little picture of a lathe and select the down arrow, and I'm going to select plus D plus Z. Now this plus D plus Z plane, I want to activate it. So bring down my grid, my WCS, my construction plane, my tool plane. Now they're all on a plus D plus Z, and you see this down below. See, the way that a lathe works is that our movements in the lathe x-axis, which would be the diameter, are diameter movements. So the way you have to think of it is, however you're programming a lathe, it's going to remove stock from the diameter, so the machine has to only move half that amount. So when we're programming, we're basically turning our y-axis into a diameter axis, or the x, and our x-axis will become the z-axis. So you kind of have to know how a lathe works for that to understand that. In the meantime, just go ahead and follow these steps, and it will work when you post out and send out to your lathe. So now with my plus D plus Z active, I'm going to go ahead and create my machine. Machine, lathe, we're just going to go default. When I come down to my toolpaths now, I'll see my machine set up. We're going to go in into our tool settings, okay, and we're not going to do the assign tool number sequentially and warn of duplicate tools because we're going to be pulling our tools out of a library. So we're not going to change this in here, and we don't have to worry about setting up a material on this one because we're going to be taking our feed calculations from the tools that I have in the tool library. So under our stock setup, go to properties. Now this is going to be the diameter and length of the stock that we're using in the lathe. So we're going to be using 3/4 inch diameter, and we're going to make it 4 inches long. And you can see on my screen that with this this dashed line here, it created an image of my stock. So we'll green check that. Now with our spindle, or our chuck jaws, if we go to properties and then go to the parameters tab, we want this diameter to match the diameter of the stock. Now this is going to open up our chuck jaws to that diameter, so 0.75. And then where are our jaws going to be positioned on the stock? I'm going to move them to minus 3.5 inches. So green check that. Now we can green check, and as you see on my screen, this blue line represents the jaws and the gray line represents the stock, and then you can still see our part here, and the plus D plus Z is active. So that's what we want to see to start this. Now our very first program is going to be a facing program. So under the toolpaths tab, we're just going to select facing. Now here's where you're going to have to go into that folder that you downloaded for our tools. I don't want to use Mastercam's generic tools at this point. I want to use the tools that are in my lathe. So I'm going to do select tool from library, And then I'm going to come up to this folder button, and I'm going to go find wherever I put that in my my computer. It doesn't matter where you put it. If you want to put that folder in your desktop or in your C drive, I keep mine right in my C drive, and it's called Mastercam Lathe Tools. And now when I click on it, you can see the 10 tools that I want to use. Well, my first tool is a CNMG 432. It's a very standard lathe tool. That's what I'm going to use for my initial facing and roughing. So open that, and then that's the only tool I see. Green check. Feed rate of 10 thousandths inches per rev. 400 constant surface footage. So we're not programming RPM on a lathe. We're always going to be programming constant surface footage. So as the diameter changes, my RPM calculation is going to change. Maximum spindle speed, we're going to set this at 3,000, depending on how your machine is where you'd set that at. Under the face parameters, I'm just going to face it using the stock. So that's just going to face it right at 0 here. And I don't have to do anything else. You could add multiple passes if you need to, but we don't really need to. So I'm going to green check it, and there's my tool path. Now, I'm going to use that same tool path, and I'm going to rough out just this thread area to start. Now, something you need to know about Mastercam and stock. My roughing program is not looking at this actual stock to make its passes. It's going to look at my geometry. So the first pass it takes is going to be at this 600 thousandths diameter. So it's going to be removing this full 150 thousandths on the first pass, and that's more than I want to cut. So to fix that, I actually have to change my geometry a little and able to rough this out the way I want to. And here's how I'm going to do it. Wireframe line, and I'm just going to draw my line from here straight up to about where the stock is. Now that will make it calculate this line as part of the geometry, and you'll see what it does here when we create our program. So we'll go back to our turning, rough. My chain that I'm going to select, I'm going to start here at the chamfer, and I'm going to end here on this line. And you can see that Mastercam connected all the lines for me in between. Sometimes it'll do that, sometimes it won't. When it doesn't, you just have to go ahead and click the lines, fill them in. Green check that chain. I have my tool, 400 surface footage, feed rate of 10 thousandths inches per rev, which is pretty good for roughing. Spindle speed, max spindle speed, we're going to set at 3,000 again. My rough parameters, stock to leave an X and Z of 10 thousandths right now. That'll be okay. And then we are going to change this depth of cut. So right now the depth of cut is set at 100. That's 100 off the diameter, which is actually 50 thousandths on the tool. It usually works out all right, but I'm going to, because we're in a classroom environment, we're just going to slow that down a little bit. So we're going to go 60 thousandths depth of cut, which is 30 thousandths on the tool, which is typically cutting the full radius, which will work good. And then we don't really need to change anything else on this one. We are going to change some other parameters later on in some of the other programs. So as I hit green check, you can see now that it's roughing, and it's roughing all of this stock all the way up. Now I've roughed that. I'm going to go ahead and take a finish pass on that before I move on to my relief groove. So we're just going to go finish. We're going to select the same chain. Green check. On my finish pass, I usually cut my feed rate in half. So I go from 10 thousandths inches per rev to 5. And then we shouldn't have to change anything on the finish parameters. Stock allowance is at 0. Green check. It takes one finish pass. Everything looks good. I'm going to turn these tool paths off. And now we're going to go ahead and cut this relief groove. Now, one thing Mastercam does on the stock is it updates the stock so you can see it down below what your part's going to look like pretty well based on wherever this red arrow is. So if I move this red arrow back, you can see it only updates the stock to that point. So I like to keep my red arrow all the way at the bottom, and then I can see as I progress through. Now, to cut our relief groove, we're going to be using a grooving tool path. Come on down, select groove. A chain. I'm going to use a chain, and that's going to cut this groove based on where I chain it. So I'm going to go ahead and chain from here over to here. And now you can see it selected this entire chain. So this is going to be my groove that it cuts. My tool that I want to use, I'm going to select from the library, and I'll go to my custom library again, and tool 404, this is my cutoff tool. It's going to work well for this, so we're going to go ahead and use that tool. You'll see a little picture of it here. It's 118 thousandths wide or 3mm wide blade tool. We'll green check that. The feeds and speeds for this are good. We're not going to adjust anything. They're good in the tool library. Under our groove shape parameters, we're really not going to change anything. It's got a rough and a finish pass all built into it. So we're just going to green check it. And you're going to see it cut that groove out for us. So if you want to watch how that works, we'll go ahead and play it real quick just so we can see what it looks like. So you're going to see it kind of rough out the middle and then take a finish pass along the groove. Rough, rough, then finish. So that's a decent program for cutting this groove out, the relief groove. Now I want to go ahead and turn my threads. So we're going to create a threading program. Select tool from library. In my custom library, my threading tool is tool 6, and this is an ISCAR tool. Works really good for threading. Green check that. Now, we're not going to mess with any of the feeds and speeds here. What we're going to do is go to the thread shape parameters, and then we're going to select from a table. So if I come in here and I select from this thread table, I'm trying to turn a 3/8/16 thread. So if I find 3/8/16 here and green check it, what that does is it's going to create this thread for me, and it's going to adjust the feeds and speeds accordingly. My end position of my thread, if you remember from our print, this is 600 thousandths over, and we have the relief groove, and it's 160 thousandths wide. So I'm going to head my threading tool a ½ inch over. So minus 0.5 from the end of the part. It knows the major and minor diameter that came in from the library. So what I'm going to do is go to the thread cut parameters, and I'm just going to change the number of cuts from 5 to 10, and I'm going to go ahead and green check that, and we should be good to go. So Mastercam is going to show you one solid thread on here is what it's going to look like. When you run it through the verify, that's when you'll actually see the 10 passes. And I'll show you real quick here. So here comes my threading tool, and you'll see it's got the full 10 passes on there that it's running. And that's what we're looking to do when we thread. So one thing I gotta warn you is when you post out this threading tool, depending on your post processor, it may be a little different than what your machine needs. So you have to understand the G-code threading program at your machine and able to make it work on your machine. So we're using default. This default's going to put out a generic FANUC based post. If you're running a Haas like we are, there's a little bit of G-code that we have to change in our threading cycle, our G76 cycle. So just understand that, take a look at that G-code, run it in the graphics in your machine to make sure it's going to work before you just go trusting this part of the program. Everything else should come out fine. So now that that thread is created, we are going to go ahead and finish the rest of this part. Now the reason that I do it this way is because this gets pretty thin right over here if we rough all this first, and I don't want this getting real thin and then coming back here and cutting these threads. That's why I like to cut this half of the part first, then finish the other half. So to go ahead and rough this down, the first thing I'm going to do, like before, is I'm going to extend my geometry and make that tool go a little further. If I stop my roughing tool and my finish tool right here, it's going to leave a little radius. And then my cutoff tool is going to come in and it's going to have some extra stock to fight with to get this part parted off. So I don't want to do that. So let's go ahead and draw our extra right here. Line. I'm going to go ahead and extend this out 200 thousandths, so length of 0.2. Okay, now to make sure that I rough all this extra stock, I'm going to draw this line up to the edge of the stock. So we'll green check that. Now those are the lines we're going to be using in order to rough and finish this part. So turning, we're going to go back up to rough, and then our chain that we select is going to be from here and up to there. Now you notice it didn't select this last line. I just have to go and check that. Now you see my full chain, green check. Now this CNMG that we used before will not work well because of this angle going down. This tool does not have enough clearance. So what we're going to do is use a VNMG tool, which is my tool number 3. So I'm going to go into the library and I'm going to use VNMG tool, and you can see this tool has a lot more built-in clearance. So I have to check the VNMG. Surface footage of 350, feed rate of 6 thousandths inches per rev. That'll work out okay. My depth of cut on this tool doesn't have quite the beef behind it the CNMG does, so we're going to cut that down to 40 thousandths, which will be 20 per side. Now I'm going to go ahead and look in my lead in, lead out parameters. Okay. The way we look at this is the actual lead in that is coming into the part. And from the center, whatever arrow, the direction the arrow is pointed is the direction the lead-in is going to come from. Now, I do not want to be coming from the left to lead in from this point. I want to be coming from the top because it's going to create new lead-ins down here as it roughs. And if I come in or from the right side and move to the left, it's going to be violating into my part. So I'm going to lead in from the top down, and that's going to help to alleviate any kind of lead-in issues here. And then on my lead out, it's going to move up and to the right. That's fine. So we'll green check that. And then in my plunge parameters, I want to make sure that that tool comes all the way down here and roughs all this out. So we're going to go ahead and change it to the second option here for my plunge cutting. Green check. That should be good. Green check. And you can see all the roughing passes now that tool's going to take. And you can see these green lines leads in and brings it over. And that's what we wanted. So now we can go ahead and take our finish pass. Same chain. We're going to be using the same tool for our finish. We're going to slow it down to 4 thousandths inches per rev. Everything should be good in my finish parameters. I'll check my lead in, lead outs again. Yep, I want to come down on my lead in, up on my lead out. My plunge parameters, I want to make sure it goes down in there. Green check, everything looks good. There's my finish pass. Now all we have left to do is part this tool off or cut it off. So here's my cutoff. It's asking for a bounding point. What I'm going to do is actually select just the very end of the part. I'm going to use that tool 4 that we used earlier. That's my cutoff tool. Feeds and speeds look good. All my cutoff parameters look good. You can add chamfers or radiuses or anything in here, but for what we're doing, we don't need to in this part. Green check, and you can see that it cut my part off and it disappeared. Now, I'm going to go ahead and verify this entire part in backplot and verify to see what it looks like, and then we should be good with this video. So I'm going to select everything, turn it all on. I'm going to go to backplot and verify. Under my stop conditions, I'm going to change it to operation change. Just slow my speed down a little, and then you watch, there's the facing pass, there's my rough turn, my finish turn, my relief groove. Zoom in a little here. There's my threads. There's my next rough with the VNMG. There's my finish, and then there's my parting tool. So that'll do it for this video. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel.